Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization. We have a busy week starting fresh after spring break. We have 3 events this week, and I'm pleased to say all from CJC faculty or incoming faculty for the CJC. So in addition today, just to remind you, we have Asaf Moradam, who's the incoming Goldman visiting professor with the Department of Government and the CJC. He'll be talking about October 7th attack and its implications for terrorism studies. And then Wednesday, we have Chuck Freilich, former Deputy National Security Advisor in Israel, who will be looking at, as the title suggests, Trump as a game changer or agent of chaos with regard to U.S.-Israel relations. He's also the incoming Siegel visiting professor at the CJC. And today, we are thrilled to have the opportunity to highlight an incredible work by Ambassador Ross. Ambassador Ross is known to all of you, but I'm sure, but just by way of brief introduction, he's the counselor at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he is currently the Dermont Family Professor of the Practice at the CJC. He's advised at least, I always get confused this, I think it's 4 U.S. presidents and maybe 5 administrations directly on U.S. foreign policy, and of course, including on Middle East policy. So we're grateful that he chose Georgetown as a place to launch his new book, Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. I know that we can unpack just the title, let alone the contents of the book. And of course, I'm especially delighted that we have our very own Dean Hellman here, who has agreed to moderate the discussion. So thank you very much, and we will have a quick discussion on the book and then open it up for audience Q&A. Thank you, Dean Hellman.
Now, I know there's going to be a lot of audience Q&A, lots to discuss. First of all, welcome, Ambassador Ross. It's great to have you here, and thank you again for launching your book here. It's Statecraft 2.0, an updating of, I think a very important statement of what statecraft meant when did the first version come out?
First came out in 2006. So
2006. So
19 years, but who's counting?
And when did you actually just put the pen down for this book? Because that's going to be important, I guess, to talk about.
Yes, very interesting question. The book, the timeline for publication, that basically the manuscript was done in the early fall, and the actual end to it, I was able to make a few insertions after our election.
Okay, so for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to talk about Statecraft 2.0, and then we're going to talk about Statecraft 2.0 Prime, right. Which is what happened since you put the pen down to the current moment. But before we actually talk about Statecraft 2.0 Prime, let's talk about the thrust, the basic thrust of your argument about what's changed in your understanding of the nature of statecraft in between the first book and the multipolar moment that you're describing.
Well, that's a really good question to start with, because first of all, you ask yourself a question: if you're going to do a book on a subject that you did almost 2 decades ago, why would you do it? And the reason I did it is because the world that I wrote about in 2006 is not the world of today. So in 2006, the U.S. was the uber power. In 2006, this was a unipolar world. This was not a multipolar world. We were not only dominant on the outside, even if in 2007, Vladimir Putin signaled that he wasn't going to accept a unipolar world. I wrote before he did that. Still, even then, we were still the dominant power. China was not challenging us at that point. They were still sort of embracing, at least in theory, the structure of the world, the rules that we had created, even if they didn't always play by them. we had regional powers who we were involved in Iraq, but that was of our doing. We weren't really being resisted there. So internationally, we were the uber power. We weren't challenged regionally, and we also had, even if there was a debate here on what our role in Iraq should be, there was not a debate on what our role in the world should be. So you look today, where are we? We face real competitors internationally and regionally. And we don't any longer have a consensus about what our role in the world should be. So it was in light of that I said, you know, I wrote a book that used statecraft as an approach, a concept for how you organize and approach foreign policy and national security, but I wrote it in a totally different context. And given the change in the context, I need to describe how you operate in a world where you're more constrained on the outside, but also where you're more constrained on the inside. And it led me to do some things that were quite different from the first book. One was to think about American traditions in foreign policy. Because if you can't sustain your policy because you can't strike a chord with the American public, then you're going to fail at statecraft. And the other was to say, you know, we've gotten away historically, frequently, in not doing what is essential to good statecraft, which we'll get more into, which is marrying objectives and means. We got away with it, again, because we were so powerful. Now we don't have the luxury any longer. We're not going to be able to sustain a leading role in the world, which I continue to believe is necessary, unless we're in a position where we know how to marry our objectives and the means so that we succeed. Sustaining foreign policy in a context where you're always failing is really hard, and in a sense, much of what we see right now in terms of the populist nationalist reaction that President Trump and the Vice President very much embody is very much a response to failures, very much a response to Iraq, very much a response to Afghanistan. I would say very much a response as well to the financial meltdown in 2008. So to be able to do what I want us to be able to do, we're going to have to be able to do statecraft much better, and that's really a combination of these. These are the factors that led me to write the book.
Can you explain, or in your thinking, the balance of factors between the inside and outside?
Yeah.
By inside, I mean you start to talk about changes in the American context, failures in American policy, America not making the most of the unipolar moment. So how much of it, or how much do you see the current environment as a function of American policy choices or pressures of its own making,
Yeah.
versus changes in the external context, which structurally sort of shifted the balance of power around the world, and America having to respond to that regardless of what happens in the American context?
I mean, it's an interesting question because, and it won't surprise you when I say both.
Yeah, of course.
First, our failures on the outside also gave increasing rise to others to believe they could challenge us more.
Okay.
I go through and at one point I sort of trace some of Putin's behaviors, and we don't really react when he goes into Georgia. We don't really react when he takes Crimea. We impose sanctions, but they're really minimalist sanctions. When he begins really to carry out a war in the Donbass area, he begins by saying, "Oh, it's not us." Then he admits, "Oh yeah, our soldiers go there, but they only go there on holiday." So he's still trying to create some distance, but again, it draws almost no reaction from us. So that creates more of an incentive on his part, or at least a belief, to believe that there's not much price in terms of what he's doing. So there's some of that is driven by our actions, our failures. Some of it is driven by our not responding the way we might have, and clearly, Iran is using its proxies in a way that also makes it see this is pretty successful. So some of this is a limitation on our part. But you know, the fact is, when you lose a domestic consensus on what America's role in the world ought to be, by definition, that's constraining. And it forces it forces leaders to think more about the domestic constraints than maybe in the past they might have. As someone who's, Jonathan, you got this right, as someone who worked for, in really 5 administrations, but 4 at a political level, presidents always take into account domestic factors. But I'll tell you, in my experience, what is striking is how rarely they're decisive in terms of the decisions that they make. If it's a big decision, they'll be aware of it, they'll have their domestic political advisors who will make them aware of it and remind them. But if they really decide something's important for national security interests, in my experience, they made the decision they thought was the right decision, and it wasn't really shaped by what they thought the domestic reaction would be. I think we're in a setting now, or at least prior to President Trump, where the domestic constraints, I think, were going to figure much more prominently. I mean, when I say that, I think with Biden that was less true because Biden was such a throwback in so many ways. But I look at Trump right now, and his decisions look like they're all very much geared towards his base.
Well, talk a little bit more on the domestic side and the U.S. side and this loss of a consensus within the U.S. about American foreign policy. How much of it, if it was a function of American failures, what would you define as the 2 or 3 most important in the time frame that you're looking at? As the these were the touchstones, if you will, that really unraveled whatever consensus there might have been or could have been?
You go back to 9/11, and there you have this extraordinary degree of unity. Yeah. And for a couple of years, you kind of lose checks and balances as well. The media is much more constrained. The Congress is willing to give a kind of really a blank check to the administration. It's the Iraq War, for sure, that is the beginning of this, because the costs are so high, the benefits are not clear, the expectations that were created are not at all fulfilled. Where were the weapons of mass destruction? I mean, the whole motivation for this was the worst weapons cannot be put in the worst hands. And so we have to go in there to ensure that Saddam Hussein, who we see as backing terrorists, if he gets the worst weapons, he's either going to use it or he's going to put them in the worst hands. And then it turns out there are no weapons of mass destruction. I actually write in the Iraqi chapter, if we had found biological weapons or what are crude nuclear weapons, the perception here and internationally would have been very different. Mm-hmm. But having played this up as the nature of this profound threat, I remember Condi Rice at one point says it's too late when you've seen the first mushroom cloud. So there's a justification for going in, and that justification doesn't exist. And then the price is high. And you look at the cost to the American military. We have people serving in Iraq and in Afghanistan going back 4 and 5 times. And then the stories about the terrible price they and their families are paying, plus the cost of the war, and the lack of what's seen as achievement, all of this really profoundly shakes, I think, the consensus. I think the financial meltdown in 2008 then raises basic questions about expertise and sort of the elite and their views. So I look at this as being a time when the source of the domestic consensus is weakened. You could argue that President Obama comes in and is a source of inspiration, and he himself is clearly an internationalist, and he wants to engage, but he's not he's a believer in American power, but in mostly a non-military sense. he is someone who is very reluctant to get drawn into other conflicts. And, you know, I think partly because he's dealing with a Republican Congress which is opposed to most everything he does, it's not so much that he's failing, but he is contending with a political climate that has changed, become more polarized, and an example of it is he does a nuclear deal with the Iranians. Mm-hmm. And he never even thinks about sending it to the Senate because he's convinced there's no chance. And what he does agree to do is to allow the Congress, in a sense, to veto it. But to be able to veto it, you need 2/3 in each house, so it doesn't require a lot to be able to get there. So even the way he approaches this, he's kind of acknowledging, I can't command a domestic consensus to be able to produce this as a treaty, but I'm still going to get it through. That's another, in my mind, it's not the cause. This is more the result of the change here.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want you to talk a little bit about what's happening outside the United States, because obviously that changes the nature of power, the rise of China, the rise of a number of other sort of centers of power that might have, one might argue, been driven by the unipolar moment, because the globalization story, essentially maybe creates the economic environment in which these multipolar centers thrive. Did that unipolar moment kind of inevitably create, through its globalization strategy and others, the basics for a multipolar world, or at least just things, kind of exogenous, or maybe driven by our own mistakes, for that matter? Well,
here again, I think it's now I'm showing I've been a diplomat. Yeah, it's both. It's interesting. Henry Kissinger said it's inevitable. We will always come back to some kind of balance of power. And so he actually, at one point, he wrote about when there's so much American power, it's bound to produce a reaction. And from his standpoint, we had an interest in creating a wider set of relations, including deepening with China was one of the things that he had in mind, because he was concerned that you would produce this kind of mobilization of a coalition against us. I think there is something to that. I think it's hard to deny that there's something to that. But, look, had we been successful in all of our policies, success breeds success. And when you fail, it also builds the view of others. We have openings now, we have opportunities now. It is interesting, you go back to 2003, and the Iranians, almost immediately after Saddam Hussein fell, they sent a message through the Swiss to us saying they were prepared to suspend entirely their nuclear development. They were prepared to stop supporting Hezbollah and Hamas with military means and treat them exclusively as political parties. There was a profound sense on their part that they were next. And instead of being next, we end up being sucked into a war that becomes increasingly a sectarian war that creates opportunities for them. And so more Shia militias emerged from all this. Had we succeeded, and I have a long Iraq chapter, the first part of how badly statecraft was done getting into the Iraq war, and then, interestingly enough, in the second term of Bush, how well the surge was done from a statecraft perspective in terms of seriously looking at what the options were. In a way, the striking thing about going into the war in Iraq is there was never even a debate about the pros and cons. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible that you could go to war with no debate about the pros and cons. Whereas with the surge, there is Steve Hadley, under Bush's direction, organizes 3 parallel, no holds barred reviews, and then he brings them all together. And they challenge everything. Condi Rice, I quote her in here, she was asked the question, well, what was different in 2003 and then in 2007? And she said, George Bush was different. He asked really hard questions. He realizes the strategy is failing. And so now he asks really hard questions, and something else that he does, once the surge is done, there are new appointments to Iraq. So we have David Petraeus replaces General Casey. I'm going to say Casey is there, and then he replaces Casey, and Ryan Crocker replaces our ambassador there. And Bush does a daily call with them so that they will identify what it is they need. It's striking because Bush in the first term is really hands-off, and Bush here in the second term is completely hands-on. But I raise it not just because of that, because one of the things that is important for us to exercise good statecraft is to ensure you have whole-of-government efforts. And Bush, when he would do these daily calls, and they would say, here's what we require, Hadley would be in on the calls, National Security Advisor, and then he would give instructions to every part of the government about who had to do what to be responsive. And it wasn't only military. We had these provincial reconstruction teams that were going out and basically doing development and modernization in the different provinces. And that requires not just the State Department and AID, but there was literally a whole-of-government approach to this. Strong presidential leadership helps to ensure you have that. Strong presidential leadership by itself is not enough, because you had strong presidential leadership that got us in to the war. So there's no question, it's a combination of our failures on the outside and others seeing how they can take advantage of that, and us learning, but maybe learning a little bit late.
Well, you're talking about, in the examples you gave, the role of leadership. I want you to turn the lens to yourself and to the foreign policy community, because obviously, we've sort of seen even before this administration, discussions of the foreign policy professional community as a blob, as a kind of essentially a mass, and obviously now when we start to talk about Trump, a kind of almost visceral reaction against foreign policy professionalism.
Right.
You talked about the role of leadership. Given the fact you are in a pole position within the blob, right. so to speak, what do you think in terms of maybe being self-critical about the nature of the foreign policy professional community? What role they played in mishandling the unipolar moment and bringing us to where we are today?
No, really, it's a very fair question. One of the things I point out, one of the conclusions I draw from this is, there's a real danger with groupthink. Every time we see groupthink, and I go through it, I point it on the right and the left. And here I would say that a lot of the foreign policy professionals were responsible for contributing to the groupthink instead of questioning it. And it's easy to fall into the habit, but you really do need people who are self-critical and who are prepared to examine their own assumptions, something that is almost never done within the government. I will tell you, of all the people I worked with, the only one who explicitly did that was Madeleine Albright. Madeleine would say to us, how are our assumptions working out? Are they being validated? Are they being invalidated? And it's very rarely done. And I would say the foreign policy, the professionals lack some of the self-criticism that is required. Because you have to, look, I tell my students, many of whom I see here, don't fall in love with your own assumptions. It's really easy to do, and then you get habituated to them. You just take them as a given. And if you're not examining them all the time, it's really easy to fall victim to what ends up being an approach that is somehow not geared to the reality that you're actually dealing with.
Yeah. Well, look, now take us to the difference between Statecraft 2.0 and 2.0 Prime.
Yeah.
From the time, just in the last 8 weeks, if not every assumption, so many assumptions about what we thought was feasible and not feasible in the sphere of international relations and in the response to the policies.
Yeah.
The policies themselves are what they are. But the extent that the reaction against the policies in the American public,
Right.
The response to the European response, obviously, to what we've sort of seen in the turnaround in Ukraine and Russia, policies in the Middle East, that is as a shock, I think, to just about everyone.
Yeah.
To what extent, what have you been rethinking, even from the time that you set the pen down to where you are now, in terms of your thinking about where America is in terms of its understanding of this multipolar world? Because I think we're further than ever from understanding the nature of the multipolar world. And what do we even begin to do to repair and get the kind of understanding that you're looking for?
Right. I'm smiling because I'm not prepared to give up what I still think we need to do. One of the things I do say in here in the conclusion, I mean, obviously, if Harris had won, we would be talking about an approach to policy where, using the kind of checklist I provide in the end, they would have been much more likely to do. That doesn't mean that you give up on this administration or even President Trump. What I mean by that is, one of the reasons that we have always had a hard time in Republican and Democratic administrations alike in marrying objectives and means is because we don't adopt the right objective. And we don't adopt the right objective for a variety of reasons. We don't understand the situation we're getting into. That was Iraq. There are political pressures. Lyndon Johnson was fearful that we would become mired in Vietnam, but he was more fearful that he would be accused of losing Vietnam, and the lessons he drew that the Republicans gained by accusing the Democrats of having lost China actually shaped why he does what he does in Vietnam. We form objectives or adopt them at such a high level of generality, there's no way to be able to implement them. All right, why do I say this in answer to your question? Because with President Trump, you're not going to go through a very sophisticated, nuanced approach to, here are the pros and cons of this objective. But with him, you're going to go and you're going to say, with this objective, you win. With this objective, you lose. Iran gets a nuclear weapon, you lost. Ukraine loses its sovereignty, so you won't have access on favorable terms to their raw earth minerals, you lost. It means you can still try to focus on the right objectives with him, provided you can explain it to him in terms that he weighs. So that's one of the reasons I'm not giving up. Second reason, he's doing all sorts of things right now that is a shock. And some of it is deliberately for shock effect. I'll give one example. His relocation of Palestinians out of Gaza. It has a shock effect. Never going to happen in terms of the mass relocation. Doesn't mean, by the way, on a volunteer basis, Palestinians who would like to leave shouldn't be able to leave. But the idea that you're going to have a mass relocation is not going to happen. And it's not just because others won't take it. It's also because for the Arabs and Palestinians in general, a mass relocation is seen as the effort to end the Palestinian issue by transfer. So it's not going to happen. But he uses it, or at least the people who work for him, use it to say to the Arabs, okay, you don't like that? Come up with a practical plan. The Arabs are masters at coming up with slogans, not practical plans. Now, the Egyptians have come up with a plan, and I would say 40% of it is practical, 60% of it is not. Now, if the administration is serious, they'll start saying, okay, let's go through what would make this practical. Most fundamental thing, this is a very long proposal, the one that's actually out there, very long. The word Hamas does not appear in it. So you're going to create under the rubric of what I call reconstruction for demilitarization. Well, who is it that has to be demilitarized? And what is it that has to be demilitarized? There are ways to deal with that, but it's not there now. And the fact that the Egyptians weren't prepared to be explicit about it raises questions about how serious they are. But that you can explore, that you can pursue. So that's still a way of sort of trying to marry objectives and means. Apropos of the shock, so on Friday I met 2 separate meetings with 2 senior visiting European officials. I would say that shock would be an understatement. They are completely unsettled. You know, it's like the world they knew, they have to somehow come to grips with the reality it doesn't exist now. And what are they going to do on their own? But one of the reasons I'm not willing to give up, we're in the 7th week of an administration. There are no successes. I mean, he's going to have his own set of failures. And when you have failures, somebody has to rethink. And he may, I mean, I don't expect him to assume responsibility for the failures, but I suspect that he'll want to look for ways to succeed. You can't claim you're going to succeed at everything, and when you don't, you decide, yeah, I'm going to double down, I'm going to fail more. So it's too soon to totally write this off. I mean, there's plenty of reason to be unsettled. To see us voting in the UN with Belarus, North Korea, is a shock to anybody's system. To see what we saw in the White House, in the Oval Office with Zelensky, was enough to make one ill. So, you know, we're going to have to see if there's some kind of adjustment on his part. I believe there will be, just because he's not going to succeed otherwise.
But I just want to ask you, and this will be my last question, and I'm going to open it up to all of you. In terms of the lessons for statecraft,
Yeah.
going back to your, Gaza Riviera,
Yeah.
shocking,
Yeah.
proposal. As you rightly point out, you put some proposal on the table, whether or not it was strategic,
Yeah.
or just a visceral, this is what a real estate agent developer
Right.
thinks of when
Right.
he thinks about a problem. As you say, it pushes the Arab states to come up with some
Right.
form of solution. People would argue similarly in the transatlantic relationship. The shocker of the Munich Security Conference
Right.
and the shocker of the Zelensky forces the Europeans to confront the problem that we have known for a long time.
Right.
And at the same time that he is actually forcing things to happen that haven't happened for decades, he's also playing quite well to the base. And not just his base, but actually quite much of a larger foreign policy community within the United States electorate.
Right.
So they're saying, oh, look, he's standing up for America,
Yeah,
he's
yeah.
not getting pushed
Yeah.
around. Whereas Biden talked about a foreign policy for the middle class, he clearly never connected with the middle class
Right.
in foreign policy. So is there a lesson from statecraft, this kind of bullishness, if you will, this kind of brutishness, if you want to describe it as that, this raw use of power? Is that something we've overlooked as a tool of statecraft in this multipolar environment?
Here I would say, consistent with my answer so far, yes and no. Look, one of the things I talk about is framing of issues. How you frame issues, how you seize the initiative on an issue counts for a lot. Now, normally you want to frame issues in a way that makes you more attractive. You draw others to you. That's soft power. He kind of dispenses with that. He uses the framing to shock, for a shock effect. But there is a value in that, in the sense that it builds your leverage. Leverage is a fundamental, the key to good statecraft is, in the end, knowing how to mobilize the right kind of leverage, with that, what you have on your own and what you can mobilize from other. Framing an issue usually helps you do that. Jim Baker was a master at doing that. Donald Trump isn't interested he's not interested from a soft power perspective of making us attractive. He's interested in forcing others to respond to him. It makes his base feel proud and say, yeah, that's what we should be doing. And in the near term, it can make others respond to you. The interesting thing is, he certainly isn't forcing Putin to respond to him. And the question is there something hidden that we're not seeing that he's really conveying to Putin? I mean, what I would have hoped that he would do is something like, and this gets to this issue of leverage, and I mean, the heart of your question is there value at times at conveying a much tougher posture? The answer is yes, but what I worry about is if it isn't backed up, then you end up exposing yourself. When you lose the credibility, really hard to regain it. His greatest leverage today is unlikely to continue unless he has successes. And when others see, I mean, we had our failures and that created a sense of opportunity for our challengers. His great claims look pretty good if they get translated into results. And they don't look very good if they don't. So I do think there is something to be said for knowing how and when to convey a strong posture. It has to be believable. What gives him a certain degree of believability right now is his unpredictability. Precisely because he's unpredictable, it scares a lot of actors. So, you know, Thomas Schelling wrote, you know, 50 years ago, The Rationality of Irrationality. And Trump must be a student of Schelling because he's pretty good at conveying that.
I doubt he did the direct reading himself.
Yeah, but that's
Let me open it up. There's so much we can cover here, and I'm sure there are also so many questions you have about what's happening. Let me just open it up to the audience. Who wants to begin? Yeah, sure.
Hello, Ambassador Ross. My name is Rory. I'm a student of yours, of course.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could give your assessment of Keir Starmer's statecraft in recent weeks with his both meeting with Trump in the Oval Office and then his meeting with Zelensky and the Ukraine summit in Downing Street.
I know you're asking the question not just because you come from there. I know that. I do think he has leaped into a vacuum. He was smart enough to see that there was a vacuum there, and he's positioned himself, I think, quite well. What's interesting, when I say quite well, he's not alienated Trump, and he has mobilized the Europeans in support of Zelensky quite effectively, made easier by what Trump did, but nonetheless, he took advantage of it to host everybody. Here again, the key is you still have to fill it with substance. You still have to deliver something. So it's going to be the follow-through. But I think in terms of the early moves that he made, I was really happy to see him. And I thought they were quite effective. And I can see himself being able to be, and this kind of serves a kind of traditional British role, being a bridge between us and the Europeans and maybe Zelensky, which is, given everything with Brexit that we've seen, this is actually a quite interesting role for a British Prime Minister to be able to reassume. And I suspect it will actually help him politically within the UK.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for choosing our university to launch your book. My name is Antonia, and I'm a security studies student here at Georgetown. I come from Romania. And looking at what Trump's presidency means in terms of making statecraft very much against the state, with actions such as seeing big tech being more active in discussing and being very present in negotiating with the European powers, or seeing Elon Musk as becoming a very much more visible spokesman, even more visible than Marco Rubio when it comes to foreign policy towards the European Union. Do you think who actually will govern statecraft in this new era, and how it can survive this era in which you would see backlash from the political sphere towards these institutions that are key for advancing US's foreign policy goals?
Look, it's a really interesting question. I ask myself a lot, who do I think is really going to be influencing Trump in foreign policy? So far, I think Donald Trump is influencing Donald Trump in foreign policy. You know, I think that inevitably you get into the questions of execution, not just framing, but execution. So those who are, I think, you know, you look at the National Security Advisor, you look at Secretary of State, are they able to focus him more on how you get things done? If he runs into problems, you have this interesting example of the British Prime Minister trying to create more of a coalition that can then work with him. We may see different actors emerge who feel that they can be the ones who can help deliver products and deliver the U.S. One of the things I will tell you that gives me some pause is also, and something I had anticipated. I had anticipated that Putin would come very early to Trump and say, look, I can help you in Iran if you give me what I need in Ukraine. I don't like that trade, but it's in keeping with your question. A real issue is, aside from the people within the administration and different leaders who, in a sense, break the operational code of Donald Trump, those who really understand how to deal with him will be able, I think, to affect both their statecraft and ours. Yep.
Other questions? Evan, what did I say?
Get Evan next.
Thank you, Anderson Rose. So my question is that, so you're saying that in order to achieve objective, it has to be aligned with available means. So looking at the current development war in Ukraine, that Russian force is advancing, and does Trump has the available means to force President Putin into the negotiating table and end more swiftly? We all follow the news that the U.S. has available means to force Ukraine, and how about with Russia? How far is it? Thank you.
Okay. The short answer is, clearly he has leverage on both. We've only seen him so far apply leverage on Ukraine. And the leverage he's applying on Ukraine is quite real, because he's suspended not just assistance, he's also suspended intelligence sharing, which has a pretty profound effect. So he has a lot of leverage on Ukraine, although he can't force Ukraine to surrender, and they're not about to. But he clearly has a lot of leverage, and we'll see this week, because Zelensky's meeting today in Saudi Arabia with the Crown Prince. The head of his military and his foreign minister will meet with Rubio, not with Witkoff, and Zelensky himself isn't going to meet with them, but at least his team is. But the leverage on the Russians is quite real. We're just not seeing it. Let's take a step back. Russia has lost 700,000 dead and wounded. One of the reasons they're drawing on North Koreans in actually pretty surprising numbers. They have lost, I think, close to 2/3 of their armor. They're drawing on very vintage armor now. They have 21% interest rates. They have inflation that's double digit. They've had a big brain drain. Putin is not in a strong position. If Trump had gone to him and maybe quietly and said, look, I'm prepared to, here's an outcome I'm prepared to live with. And he said, you're not going to just be able to claim the territories where you are, but we'll have referendum. We'll have a referendum in Crimea, we'll have a referendum in the Donbass, and you'll accept the outcomes. If you're so confident that you'll win, you should be able to accept that. And if you're not prepared to accept this, then I will tell you now, then Ukraine will become a member of NATO. We will support it. And I can tell you that we will maintain our support for Ukraine. And we'll see how well you can do over the next couple of years. So he had a lot of leverage that he could apply to Putin. We just haven't seen it. Maybe it's being subtly conveyed. If it is, then the chances of producing a deal are there. Every time I hear the president say that Putin wants peace, the problem is he wants peace exclusively on his terms. And the way he defines peace is Ukraine surrenders. So that's not peace. But maybe we're just not seeing it. Maybe he decided that by publicly seeming to embrace Putin, it will make it easier for Putin to make certain adjustments. I hope that's not wishful thinking. I suspect that it is wishful thinking, because I actually think that he's not making it easier to reach an outcome by seeming to ask so little of Putin. And then even after Putin responded to the American suspension of assistance and intelligence by launching one of the biggest assaults yet of missiles and cruise missiles. It was something, again, I expected to happen. And Trump, when he was asked about it, said, well, we might have to impose sanctions we've never imposed. And then about 90 minutes later, he says, well, he's just doing what you would expect him to do, like, gee, I did this and it's okay for him to do that. So I'm hoping that he will apply the leverage. In the end, the good news, ironically, is there'll be no deal unless he does. If the only leverage he continues to apply is to the Ukrainians, there'll be a deal because they won't surrender. And Putin will feel he doesn't have to do a deal. So I think it will lead them back inevitably to have to put pressure on Putin.
Evan.
Good afternoon, Evan Medeiros, Penner Chair in Asian Studies. Dennis, thank you for a wonderful book. You remain a role model for students, professors, former practitioners alike, so I'm very excited to dig into the new volume. So I have one comment and one question. So you and I served in the Obama NSC together. We did some really interesting, fun work with the Chinese.
Yep.
So I've reflected a lot on the strengths and the weaknesses of Obama foreign policy, and there's a lot to say looking at Obama's decisions. But one thing that I come back to, and I wanted to get your reaction to, is so many of the debates that happened in the Obama administration were so focused on the benefits and disadvantages of action. Nobody ever talked about, except in the Asia Directorate, the consequences of inaction. Because of course what we were seeing was the emergence of Xi Jinping, a rising power, and what inaction would signal. And just like your reactions to that, do you think that's a sort of accurate assessment, and why is it that perhaps that was the nature of those discussions in the Obama administration? The question for you in your book, I see the subtitle is What America Needs to Do to Lead in a Multipolar World.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, given everything that's happened, all of the different crises that you identified, the global financial crisis, Iraq, Ukraine, etc., is there still a demand externally in this emerging multipolar world for American leadership? As a sort of classically trained scholar of international relations, Kissinger wrote many, many decades ago that order is the result of two things, power and legitimacy. America still clearly has a lot of power. Whether you like it or not, it's pretty indisputable. But the legitimacy question is a real one. So is that demand there? Can we ever get back to a point where we can match American power with American legitimacy? Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. Yes, we had a good trip together. So I want to deal with both the comment and the question. I'll start with the question first. The legitimacy is going to be shaken by this administration, because this is an administration that operates exclusively on the question of interest, not values. I said I do a chapter here where I look at American traditions, and every American president since the end of World War II, on the spectrum of interests and values, some tilted more towards interest, some tilted more towards values, but there was always some element of both. And the reaction of the rest of the world, in part, was driven by the fact that America stood for something. And because it stood for something, those values gave us legitimacy. When I sit, as I said, with two senior European officials, one of the things that that I was struck by was their concern, their fundamental concern about what does America stand for now? It's not just that we're shaken because we don't think that America is actually prepared to be an ally, and we see an America that looks like it's prepared to align more with those who threaten us. It was, what do you stand for? And it's pretty hard to say that the Trump administration stands for anything other than what's going to be good for America. And traditionally, we felt, because of who we are, because of the nature of our values that are more universal, that when we see freedom growing, when we see tolerance growing, when we see certain basic norms respected internationally, that was good for America. Right now, this administration defines what's good for America differently. So it will be difficult. I fall back on the idea that if we're going to succeed, we're going to have to do some things differently, and maybe that will contribute to that. Now, in answer to your comment, first, you will especially like the book because I deal with this issue frequently. Diplomacy and statecraft depend, when I say on leverage, it means diplomacy has to be backed by coercion. Now, coercion can be negative and positive. It can reflect, you coerce sometimes by what you offer. But there has to be a clear sense of what you stand to lose. Apropos of what you were saying about how you saw Xi Jinping, I used to say with President Obama, especially on Syria, where I write a lot about, he would always ask the question, tell me how this ends. And I would used to say to him, that is a completely legitimate question. But there's a corollary you also have to answer. And the corollary is, tell me what happens if we do nothing. Because the cost of action is always easy to anticipate. The cost of inaction is always much harder. The burden of proof was on people like you and me, for us to explain what is largely an abstraction. And in the Obama administration, the cost of action always trumped the cost of inaction. But it will always come back to haunt you if you don't weigh that as well. And I talk about the role of coercion in successful diplomacy and give examples of it.
Well, while we have you here, I can't pass up the chance to ask you, in the same spirit of tell me how it ends, let's talk about the Middle East and obviously your extraordinary experience there over a career.
Yeah.
So tell me how this ends. And actually, what is the cost of inaction if we kind of let it play out on its own sort of steam? So
if we just let it play out, we will lose actually an extraordinary opportunity. The Israelis, through their military achievements, transformed the regional balance of power. They did not have a political strategy to translate the military successes into something more enduring. The Trump administration inherits a situation where Iran has never been so weak. Economically, just to give you a sense, right now they can't provide power on a consistent basis, electricity, to 24 of 31 provinces. This is a country that produces natural gas and oil. Right now, its currency at the official level is traded at 42,000 real to the dollar. The actual exchange rate is actually 930,000 real to the dollar. So economically, it probably is as weak as it has been, number one. Number two, the Israelis took out their long-range strategic air and missile defense. Israel could attack now without having to worry about the radars. So they are profoundly vulnerable because of that. They are susceptible to an agreement, though they will try to resist it, and Trump, we now know, has sent a letter to the Supreme Leader. I say this just to say we have a context where Iran is weaker than it's been. We may or may not see diplomacy succeed, but there is an opportunity for it. Syria is going through a convulsion right now, although there was an interesting agreement today between the transitional head of Syria and the head of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is largely a Kurdish group. They signed a 9-point agreement today that will fold the SDF into the government, which is quite a good move given the events of the week. Hezbollah was weakened to the point where they could not prevent the emergence of a president and a prime minister, and the statement of the cabinet drops, for the first time in memory, the reference to the right of resistance, which was a code word for Hezbollah having the right to have kind of independent arms. So there is a real opportunity to change the regional balance of power, and to get at how does this end, it depends on what we do. There are 3 things that have to happen this year, or should, if we want to see real change. One is end the Gaza war, and I can get into a discussion of how that could be done. 2 is to deal in a definitive way with the nature of the Iranian nuclear program. Iran can have civil nuclear power, but it can't have a nuclear weapon. And here again, there's a couple of different outcomes that could either be negotiated, or you could end up seeing the use of force. It's the threat of the use of force that makes the outcome more likely. And the third thing, that if you produce those 2 things, then you get Saudi normalization with Israel. Saudi normalization with Israel, the Saudis will require something on the Palestinians, but we also have to require something from the Saudis on the Palestinians. I can tell you, as having negotiated for this for a long time, the natural instinct of most Arab states was always to adopt slogans when it came to this issue and expect us to deliver. And you know, we have a responsibility to deliver because we do have a relationship, we have influence with Israel that nobody else has. But the Arabs also have an influence. In the case of the UAE, when they did the Abraham Accords, and the UAE was the Trump administration did the Abraham Accords, I can say definitively without any qualification, the hero of the Abraham Accords was the UAE, because the UAE came to the Trump administration and said, we'll do normalization with Israel as long as there's no annexation. So the Saudis are saying, we'll do normalization with Israel, we want a defense treaty with you, but we need something on the Palestinians. We need to be saying to the Saudis, we can deliver a pathway for the Palestinians. We can deliver that, but you want a pathway to a Palestinian state. There'll be no Palestinian state if there isn't fundamental reform within the Palestinian Authority, because otherwise you'll have a failed state. So you want us to deliver a pathway to a state. Your responsibility is to, maybe it's the Arab Quint, which is Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Egypt, and Jordan. You go as a collective and you insist that there has to be reform, and you don't do it in abstract terms. It has been done before. The Bush administration in 2007 insisted with Abu Mazen that he had to appoint Salam Fayyad as an empowered prime minister, which he did, and for 5 years we saw real reform. So it can be done. So I'm saying the key to all this, we will have to end the war in Gaza. Israel succeeded in dramatically weakening Hamas, but it didn't have a strategy for what comes as an alternative to Hamas. The UAE has actually helped to develop a plan, including one that involved a stabilization force with the UAE on the ground. The Egyptian plan that has been presented doesn't deal with security or stabilization except at a very high level of abstraction. There needs to be, here again, this is an opportunity for the Trump administration to take what, by the way, was during Biden's time was actually negotiated between the UAE and Israel. There are the outlines of what can be a day after plan. It won't happen unless the US takes the lead and mobilizes the support. It's there. The day after plan will allow you to pretty much create an alternative to Hamas. Hamas is not going to be eradicated any more than we could eradicate ISIS. But Hamas has been weakened. Again, I go through this in the book at in the concluding chapter. One of the things that Israel should have done in defining its objective, when the Prime Minister said we're going to have total victory, that's not an objective, it's a slogan. So what would have been the objective? Okay, how much of Hamas's military do we have to destroy? How much of the infrastructure do we have to be able to destroy? How much of the tunnel system do we have to be able to destroy so that it becomes really hard for Hamas to reconstitute itself? If you combine those answers to those questions, which I think we're not that far away from being able to deal with, we actually have this ironic situation. The only time Hamas dons its uniforms is during the ceasefires. And then they put on a show when they're releasing the hostages. I don't want to say they're a Potemkin village because I think they do control things right now, but they control things because no one sees an alternative. If you go ahead and you present an alternative in terms of a transitional administration, which would be regional and international, there are 60,000 today Palestinians who work in functional issues who've been there before Hamas, are not political. They could work under this regional international umbrella. You create a stabilization force. They provide law and order. You can probably use security contractors. You have to ensure three things. You have to ensure that there is no smuggling, because Hamas got whatever it needed because of smuggling. You have to ensure that the distribution of assistance is guaranteed and is secure so Hamas can't seize it and then resell it, which is what they've done. And you have to ensure that the rehabilitation and reconstruction materials that will come in can be controlled so there's no diversion. Hamas is weakened to the point that if it's not in a position to reconstitute itself, it will not be able to come back. And if you have enough law and order and you have enough of a stabilization force there to ensure it, then the Israelis can be assured that they actually can get out. Now, the key is, right now, Hamas says they won't release the hostages unless there's an end to the war. Israel's not going to end the war as long as it looks like Hamas is in control. So you basically have to come in with a very practical approach, with a plan, with all the mechanisms that you can show to the Israelis. And I said, at least during the Biden administration, until the very end, there was a negotiation going on directly between the Israelis and the UAE. And you take all that, you can put it together, and that gives you a chance to end the war. You end the war, the Saudis will probably move on normalization. You're still going to have to deal with the Iranian nuclear question sometime this year. And I say that because the Iranians right now, even though they're quite weak, they are accelerating their enrichment of uranium. They're enriching 30 kilograms a month at 60% enrichment. The head of the IAEA says there is no justifiable civilian purpose to enrich to 60%. No country that has ever enriched to 60% has not gone along and produced a nuclear weapon. So you have to deal with that as well. But you deal with those three things, you actually have a chance to put the Middle East on a completely different trajectory than it is. If you don't, then you also have an implication that's pretty clear.
Well, that's where we're going to have to end it. But I can't help but ask the question. What you describe seems kind of within the grasp of the imaginable,
yes,
which is extraordinary, as you say. Yeah. It's a function of the significant changes that have happened over the course of these 2 years. The ability of Trump, even though some of this was, as you said, negotiated well before Trump, to take credit for dealing with this intractable set of problems is that the possibilities are just so remarkable that he could be seen as the peacemaker, and yet why throw it all away with literally a throwaway Gaza proposal that seems ludicrous on the face of it, but also incredibly damaging for all the things that are so close to being within the grasp.
Well, that's the reality. Is he has an opportunity, and if it's realized, and he takes credit for it, he'll deserve it. I want him to succeed.
Well, I hope there's someone there sort of telling him that he can succeed, if he just abandons some of the more ludicrous aspects of his statements. Look, there's still so much to discuss, as you can imagine, with a book that covers such an extraordinary range of issues and that builds on such an extraordinary career of experience. we could talk all afternoon, if not longer, about the lessons. But what I do want everyone and encourage everyone to do is buy the book, so you can look even more deeply and read and think even more deeply about these issues. And we are, as the students sort of said, and Jonathan sort of said, very appreciative to have you as part of our community and to have you launching this book here in our community. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being part of this. And the book is available.